My son told me to keep my mouth shut at his big company party, handing me a list of rules so I wouldn't embarrass him in front of his CEO. He treated me like a senile old woman who needed to be managed, completely unaware that he was standing in a ballroom that I built at a gala, celebrating the 50th anniversary of my company. He was about to learn a very public lesson. The CEO he was so desperate to impress actually worked for me. The pot roast was perfect. I know it's not a fashionable thing to say or even a fashionable thing to cook anymore, but I've always found a deep satisfaction in doing simple things well. The carrots were sweet and tender, the potatoes were fluffy, and the gravy was rich and dark, just the way my late husband Richard used to like it. My son Mark and his wife Jennifer sat at my old oak table, the one Richard and I bought at a flea market a lifetime ago. They picked at their food, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones, which were never far from their hands. Jennifer was the first to start. She looked around my living room, her eyes scanning over the bookshelves filled with actual books, the worn but comfortable armchair, the photos of Mark as a gap-toothed little boy. Her commentary was as always framed as helpful advice. She mentioned a new interior designer who was doing wonders with what she called legacy homes, a gentle euphemism for old houses like mine. She said a brighter color palette would make the space feel less dated. I just smiled and nodded, murmuring something about how I was rather fond of my clutter. She didn't understand that every object in this house was a memory, a story. To her, it was just old stuff. Mark chimed in, talking about his own home, a sleek, minimalist box of glass and steel that always felt cold to me, no matter the season. He spoke of smart refrigerators and integrated sound systems, of things that made life optimized. My life, by contrast, was hopelessly unoptimized. I still paid my bills with checks I put in the mail. I read a physical newspaper. They saw my lifestyle not as a choice, but as a failure to keep up. I was a relic, a charming but ultimately embarrassing piece of their past they had to deal with at family dinners. After the plates were cleared, Mark finally got to the real reason for their visit. It wasn't my pot roast, that was for sure. He cleared his throat, a sound he always makes when he's about to ask for something he knows is an imposition. He told me his company, a prestigious firm called Sterling Corp., was having its 50th anniversary gala. It was a very important event. He stressed a night for a lot of big names, and as a manager, he was expected to be there with family. The word family hung in the air between us. He wasn't inviting me, he was informing me of a social obligation I was required to help him fulfill. Then came the rules. It was a long list, delivered with the strained patience of someone explaining a complex task to a child. I shouldn't wear my old navy blue dress, the one I wore to his college graduation. I needed something more. Modern, though he couldn't quite say what that was. I was to stick close to him and Jennifer. I shouldn't try to engage anyone important in conversation, especially not his direct boss, or God forbid the CEO. If someone did speak to me, I was to keep my answers short and simple. Don't talk about the old days, don't mention the neighborhood, don't ask people what they do. He said it was because they would be busy, but I knew the real reason. He was afraid of what I might say. He was afraid I would be myself. I sat there on my own sofa in my own home, listening to my son map out all the ways I might embarrass him. Each rule was a small, sharp pinprick to the heart. He was so focused on the image of success that the people who had helped him get there were now just props to be managed. I looked at his face, so full of anxiety and ambition, and I barely recognized the boy who used to beg me to tell him stories about how I started my first little business from our kitchen table. He had forgotten all of that. He had forgotten me. But I just gave him another quiet smile and told him I understood. I said I would be happy to attend. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. After they left, the silence of the house felt heavier than usual. I walked over to the telephone, a sturdy old rotary phone on a side table. My fingers traced the familiar circles as I dialed a number I knew by heart. An old, familiar voice answered on the second ring. It was Arthur. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I just told him that after all these years of declining his invitations, I'd be in town for the big night. I said I was looking forward to it. I hung up and went to the front door to lock it. As I turned the bolt, I heard their voices float back from the driveway through the crisp night air. The window in the hall was cracked open just enough. It was Mark speaking, his voice low and tight with stress. I heard every single word clear as a bell. He said to Jennifer, "Just pray she doesn't open her mouth and embarrass me in front of the CEO. It would ruin everything." The week leading up to the gala was a quiet one, at least on the surface. But the words I'd overheard from my son hung in the air of my little house like a ghost. Just pray she doesn't ruin everything. Those words didn't make me angry. No, it was something colder and deeper than that. It was a clarification. It set my course. I had spent decades making myself small so my son could feel big. I had poured my life, my resources, my everything into his success, all while hiding my own. And for what? So he could be ashamed of me in front of strangers. I realized then that I hadn't just been a mother. I had been a foundation buried and forgotten while he built his fragile house on top of me. Well, foundations can shift. The shopping trip was their idea, of course. Mark and Jennifer insisted on taking me to a boutique on Newbury Street, a place where the clothes were kept behind glass, like museum artifacts, and the air smelled faintly of judgment and expensive perfume. They called it a styling session, but it felt more like an intervention. Jennifer would hold up dresses made of strange, shiny fabrics, things a woman my age had no business wearing, and talk about making a statement. I would politely decline, reaching instead for a simple, elegant dress in a dark teal silk. Jennifer would sigh dramatically and tell me I wasn't trying. Mark would just look at his watch, his jaw tight with impatience. They, on the other hand, were having a grand time. They piled clothes onto the counter as if they were collecting firewood for a long winter. A suit for Mark that cost more than my first car. A glittering sequined dress for Jennifer that seemed designed to scream, "Look at me and how much money I have." They laughed and preened in the mirrors, a perfect portrait of modern excess. I just watched my hands folded in my lap, a quiet observer to their performance. They were so busy trying to look rich, they had completely forgotten how to be wealthy. When the mountain of clothes was finally rung up, the total was breathtaking. Jennifer presented her platinum card with a flourish, as if she were bestowing a great honor upon the young cashier. The cashier swiped it. A moment of silence. She swiped it again. She looked up, her professional smile faltering slightly. The transaction was declined. Jennifer laughed a brittle, high-pitched sound. She blamed it on the store's ancient machine and produced another card from a different bank. Declined. The smile was gone now, replaced by a flush of red creeping up her neck. Mark stepped in, annoyed. He told Jennifer she probably forgot to pay a bill, his voice low, but carrying an edge of accusation. He pulled out his own wallet, a sleek leather affair, and handed over his premier executive card with an air of authority, as if the card itself wouldn't dare refuse him. The cashier swiped it. Declined. He tried another. Declined. The silence at the counter was now deafening. The few other customers in the store were beginning to stare. The whole elaborate fantasy they had built around themselves, this image of effortless success, was crumbling under the fluorescent lights of a clothing boutique. Mark, his face, a mask of thunder, stomped away to a corner to call the bank. I could hear his voice, a furious, strangled whisper that grew louder with every passing second. He was jabbing his finger in the air, talking about his credit score, his status, his reputation. Jennifer was left stranded at the counter, pretending to be absorbed in a display of silk scarves, but her stiff posture and the way she refused to make eye contact with anyone told the real story. She was mortified. The bank, from what I could gather from Mark's one-sided, increasingly desperate conversation, was no help at all. There was no fraud alert, no security breach. Their accounts were simply frozen. There was no reason. There was no one to blame. There was just a hard, immovable wall where their river of credit used to be. When Mark finally hung up, defeated and pale, I decided my part in this little play had come. I stood up, walked to the counter, and handed the cashier the simple teal dress I had chosen for myself. I opened my old, worn handbag, the one Jennifer had subtly suggested I should replace, and took out a neat stack of crisp $100 bills. I paid for my dress in cash, with enough left over for the cashier to count out my change. I took the bag with my dress in it, turned to my son and daughter-in-law, who were staring at me as if they'd never seen me before. Their faces were a mixture of shock, confusion, and for the first time a flicker of something new, fear. I looked directly at Mark, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly steady. "It's always wise to have a safety net," I said, my words dropping into the thick silence. "You never know when your name might lose its value." The silence in the car on the way home from that boutique was a living thing. It was thick with their shock and my quiet resolve. My cryptic comment about a name losing its value had landed exactly as I'd intended, like a stone dropped into a still, deep pond. It had unsettled them. For the first time in years, they had looked at me and seen not just their simple old mother, but a question mark, an unknown variable, and that I knew was a state of affairs they could not tolerate. People like my son and his wife need the world to be simple, predictable, and above all, under their control. They showed up at my house the next evening bearing a peace offering of grocery store flowers that already looked tired. They had, of course, manufactured a perfectly logical explanation for what had happened. It was a cross-bank security flag. Mark announced his confidence mostly restored. Apparently, a recent online purchase had triggered a system-wide freeze. He said it with such authority, as if reading from a script he'd rehearsed all day. Jennifer chimed in, talking about how common these technical glitches were. They had created a neat, tidy box for the chaos of yesterday and sealed it shut. It wasn't me. It couldn't have been me. It was just a fluke. A bank error. They had to believe that because the alternative was unthinkable. Once they had successfully calmed their own nerves, they turned their attention back to the real problem, managing me. They sat me down on my own sofa and presented me with what they called a game plan for the gala. It was a single sheet of paper printed out with a minute-by-minute schedule. There were designated times for me to have a drink, one specifically, and a list of safe conversation starters. Topics like the weather, the lovely decorations, and the delicious food were approved. Topics like history, business, or anything that required an actual opinion were strictly forbidden. Mark even had a little signal. He would use a subtle tug on his earlobe, which meant I was to immediately stop talking and smile pleasantly. They were treating me not like a guest, but like a volatile asset that needed to be contained. I listened to it, all my face, a perfect mask of mild grandmotherly interest. I held the schedule in my hands, studying it, as if it were the most fascinating document I had ever read. I looked at Mark, at his earnest, anxious face, and saw not a powerful manager, but a terrified little boy, desperately afraid that someone might discover his mother wasn't as polished and perfect as the life he was trying to build. I nodded slowly. I told them it was very thoughtful. I told them I appreciated how much they were looking out for me. I promised I would stick to the plan and wouldn't cause any trouble. My performance of meek compliance was flawless. They lapped it up their shoulders, visibly relaxing. They left my house that evening completely reassured, convinced they had dodged a bullet, and successfully brought their doddering old mother back under control. The little stone I had dropped into the pond had been forgotten, and the surface was calm once more. As soon as I heard their car pull away, I walked over to the phone. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different. It felt like the deep, patient silence of a hunter in a blind, waiting for the perfect moment. I dialed Arthur's number. He answered immediately. I didn't bother with small talk. I told him the first phase was complete. I told him about the simple teal dress I had purchased, in cash. We both had a quiet chuckle about that. Then my voice became more serious. I confirmed the timing of his speech not at the beginning of the night, but later, after the main course was cleared, when everyone was settled and paying full attention. I wanted the room to be captive. He confirmed the spotlight operator knew exactly where my table would be. Arthur asked if I was sure about this. His voice was full of a warmth and concern that my own sons lacked. I assured him I was. This isn't about revenge, I explained. It's not about punishment. It's about clarity. It's about a lesson in value that has been a long time coming. They need to understand. I told him that some things can't be bought and some debts can't be paid with money. He simply said he understood and that he would see me at the gala. I hung up the phone feeling a profound sense of calm. The plan was set. All I had to do now was wait. The day of the gala arrived on a wave of nervous energy, none of it mine. From the guest room in Mark's house, I could hear him and Jennifer rushing about, their voices sharp and brittle. They were still operating under the delusion that they were in charge, that their little printed schedule was the governing document for the evening. Their stress was a shield against the unsettling truth they'd brushed aside after the shopping trip. I, on the other hand, was an island of calm. I took my time getting ready, steaming the simple teal silk dress until it was perfectly smooth. I put on the small pearl earrings Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary. I felt a quiet strength settle over me. It wasn't the thrill of revenge, not exactly. It was the feeling of a long overdue correction, like a ship finally being righted in a storm. I was just about to step into my sensible heels when I heard it. A car squealed into the driveway, followed by the slam of a door and pounding footsteps on the walkway. The front door burst open without the courtesy of a doorbell chime. I heard a frantic, unfamiliar voice bark my son's name. I paused my hand on the doorknob of the guest room and listened. The voice was tight, with a unique brand of terror that only comes when a man who believes he is powerful suddenly finds out he is not. This, I deduced, must be Paul Mark's boss. His arrival was not on their meticulously planned schedule. From the sounds filtering through the door, I could piece together the scene. There was the rustle of heavy paper, a thud, as it was slammed onto a table. Paul's voice was a torrent of panicked accusations. My son's responses were confused, defensive monosyllables that quickly faded into choked silence. Paul must have been stewing ever since the credit card incident. A man like him, a man who prides himself on knowing all the angles, couldn't let a mystery like that go unsolved. He must have started digging not out of concern for me, but to find some weakness in Mark, some explanation for the anomaly. He was looking for a crack in my son's life, and instead had stumbled upon the bedrock on which the entire company was built. I could picture it so clearly. Paul, his face pale and sweaty, shoving a document into my son's hands. It would have been a copy of the company's original articles of incorporation, a public record. He must have paid a paralegal to pull that very afternoon. And there on the first page, under the bold heading Founder and Chairwoman, would be the name. Helen Amelia Peterson. Peterson. my maiden name. The name I used to sign contracts that shaped skylines. The name I used to build an empire from nothing but an idea and an unwavering belief in its value. I had become Helen Miller after Richard and I married a name I wore proudly as a wife and mother. For Mark the P in Helen P. Miller had always just been a letter, a meaningless initial on forms. Now, in the harsh light of his living room, that single letter would have ignited burning away every lie he had ever told himself about me. The cascade of understanding must have been brutal. The cryptic comment about a name losing its value wasn't a sign of senility, it was a threat. The financial freeze wasn't a bank error, it was a demonstration of absolute power. My quiet phone calls weren't gossiping with old friends. They were strategic planning sessions. My simple dress, my worn handbag filled with cash, my quiet compliance, every piece of the puzzle that was his simple, out-of-touch mother clicked into a new, terrifying picture. I was not a liability to be managed at his party. I was the reason the party was happening at all. For Paul, the realization would have been even more direct. The woman he'd dismissed, the woman whose son he patronized, the woman he'd made snide remarks about, was the silent, reclusive majority shareholder. She was the legend they spoke about in board meetings, the ghost in their machine. They had poked the bear only to find out it was a dragon. The frantic talking stopped. It was replaced by a dead, heavy silence, the kind that follows a massive explosion. Then a new sound began. It was a low, pathetic noise. It was Paul apologizing. Not to me, of course. He was babbling apologies to Mark, as if my son could somehow mediate, somehow save him. His words were a desperate, jumbled mess of excuses and frantic pleas. Mark, from what I could gather, said nothing at all. What could he say? His entire world, his career, his sense of self had been built on a foundation of condescension toward the very woman who had given him everything. He wasn't just in trouble with his boss, he was in trouble with his mother, and he was only just beginning to understand how much worse that was. When the whimpering had subsided into a shared, horrified quiet, I decided it was time. I took one last look in the mirror, smoothed my dress, and opened the guest room door. I walked into the living room with a serene smile. They stood frozen, two wax figures in a tableau of ruin. The offending document was splayed on the coffee table between them. Their faces were ashen, their eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost comical. I surveyed the scene, my gaze lingering on them for just a moment, letting the silence stretch. Then I looked at my son. "Shall we?" I asked, my voice light and pleasant. "We don't want to be late for my party." The car ride to the gala was the longest 10 minutes of my life, and I suspect it was even longer for the two men sitting beside me. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the engine and the frantic, shallow breathing of my son and his boss. They sat stiffly like mannequins, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, but seeing nothing. The carefully constructed world they inhabited with its clear hierarchies and rules of ambition had been detonated, and they were still standing in the rubble, deafened by the blast. My little comment about it being my party had been the final confirmation the sentence passed before the trial had even begun. I, on the other hand, simply looked out the window, watching the city lights blur past, feeling a strange and profound sense of peace. The storm I had been weathering internally for years was finally breaking. The ballroom was a masterpiece of corporate excess. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen waterfalls, a string orchestra played elegant, forgettable music, and hundreds of the city's most influential people mingled their laughter, echoing in the vast space. For Mark and Paul, it was no longer a networking opportunity. It was a torture chamber. They flanked me like disgraced bodyguards, their faces pale masks of terror. Their earlier plan to manage me was now a hilarious, tragic memory. Instead, they were the ones being managed, tethered to me by an invisible leash of their own making. Jennifer, my daughter-in-law, who had been waiting for us inside, took one look at her husband's face and her own confident smile faltered. She started to ask what was wrong, but Mark shot her a look of such pure panic that the words died in her throat. We took our seats at a prominent table near the stage. Paul, ever the sycophant, rushed to pull out my chair. His hands were trembling. Throughout the first course, they both tried to act normal, making vapid conversation about the floral arrangements and the wine, but their eyes kept darting towards me, searching for some sign, some hint of what was to come. I offered them none. I ate my salad with a steady hand, smiled pleasantly at those who greeted our table, and remained a perfect enigma of grandmotherly calm. I was the bomb in the center of the room, and they were the only ones who could hear the ticking. Finally, the moment came. The dinner plates were cleared, the lights dimmed slightly, and my old friend Arthur, the current CEO, walked onto the stage. He was a good man with a face that was kind but carried the weight of his position. He tapped the microphone and a hush fell over the room. He began his speech welcoming everyone and thanking them for 50 years of success. Then his tone shifted. He began to speak of the company's origins of a time before it was a glittering corporation. He spoke of a founder, a visionary, who believed that a company's soul was its integrity. He described her as brilliant but famously private, a woman who, after building an empire, chose to step away from the limelight to devote her life to the thing she valued most, her family. As Arthur spoke, I watched my son. Mark seemed to be shrinking in his chair, his face slick with sweat. Paul was staring at his water glass, as if it held the secrets to the universe. Arthur continued, his voice resonating with genuine admiration. He said that this founder's core belief was that hard work was more valuable than a fancy title, and that character was the only currency that never lost its worth. He paused, letting the words settle. Then he smiled. He announced that for the first time in over 30 years, this reclusive founder had honored them with her presence. He asked the room to please welcome the heart and soul of Sterling Corp. Helen. The spotlight hit me. In an instant, 1,000 pairs of eyes were on me. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, a wave of pure shock. I saw the faces of old board members, their jaws agape. I saw the confusion on the faces of the younger crowd, who had only ever known the founder as a myth. And I saw my son's face utterly broken. The ticking had stopped. The bomb had gone off. I rose slowly and made my way to the stage, the applause starting as a stunned patter and growing into a roar. Arthur hugged me warmly and handed me the microphone. I stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. I started by thanking them, my voice calm and clear. Then I began my real speech. I spoke about the pride I felt in seeing the company grow, but I also spoke of the dangers of forgetting one's roots. I said that a legacy is not a jewel to be worn, but a garden to be tended. It requires humility, dedication, and getting your hands dirty. It withers, I said, under the harsh sun of arrogance and dies when its caretakers value the appearance of fruitfulness over the health of the roots. I never once looked at my son yet. Every word was for him. I spoke of how true strength is quiet, how true wealth is not what you show to the world, but the integrity you maintain when no one is watching. The room was silent, hanging on every word. To them, it was an inspiring speech from a legend. To Mark, Paul, and Jennifer, it was a public execution of everything they stood for. I finished my speech, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the room erupted. The applause was deafening, a standing ovation that went on and on. I gave a gracious nod, handed the microphone back to Arthur, and walked off the stage. but I didn't return to my seat. I walked directly towards our table, a path clearing for me as I went. I stopped right in front of my son. He was staring at me, his eyes hollow, his face a ruin. The thunder of the applause was the perfect cover. I leaned in close as if to give him a motherly peck on the cheek. I whispered, my voice soft, but laced with steel for his ears only. Perhaps now you'll learn some respect. We'll discuss your future with my company on Monday. Then I straightened up, turned, and walked away, leaving him to drown in the sound of the world applauding the woman he had been so ashamed of. The power shift was total. The reckoning was complete. My words hung in the air between us, a final, invisible severing of the life he knew. I didn't wait for a response. I simply turned and melted back into the crowd, leaving my son standing alone in the wreckage of his own making, the roar of applause for me serving as the soundtrack to his downfall. We didn't speak again for the rest of the night. After the gala concluded, we found each other at the valet stand, a silent, broken family unit. The car ride home was a symphony of quiet despair. Jennifer sat in the back, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. But these were not tears of empathy for her husband. They were tears of mourning for a lifestyle that had just evaporated before her eyes. She was crying for the lost status, the canceled credit cards, the evaporated social standing. Mark sat in the passenger seat, a hollowed-out man. He stared straight ahead, his face utterly blank, his posture slumped in total defeat. He looked like a statue of a man who had just learned the world was not, in fact, built for him. I sat behind the wheel of my own sensible car, which I had insisted on driving, and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. My silence was the consequence now, a heavy blanket of reality smothering the last embers of their arrogance. Every mile we drove was a mile deeper into their new, unwelcome reality. The consequences when they came were swift and clean. On Monday morning, an internal memo announced the immediate termination of Paul's employment due to a fundamental misalignment with the company's core values. It was clinical, corporate, and absolute. For my son, my own flesh and blood, my decision was more complex. Firing him would have been easy, but it wouldn't have been justice. Justice, I've always believed, is not just about punishment. It's about learning. Mark was summoned to a meeting with me and Arthur. I laid out his options. He could resign, of course, or he could accept a transfer. I had created a new position just for him, an entry-level logistics coordinator at a small manufacturing plant we owned in a quiet corner of Ohio. It would be a salaried position enough to live on, but a universe away from the six-figure salary and expense account he was used to. He would have to trade his tailored suits for steel-toed boots. He would have to earn his respect from the ground up from people who wouldn't care about his last name. It was a brutal, humbling offer. He took it. He had no choice. The life they had built, that fragile house of cards financed by debt and my invisible support, collapsed overnight. The glass and steel house went on the market. The two luxury cars were repossessed. Jennifer had to find a job for the first time in a decade. They were forced to dismantle their entire facade piece by painful piece until there was nothing left but the truth of their situation. They had been living a lie, and the lie was over. The story of that night, of course, took on a life of its own. In the boardrooms and country clubs of the business world, it became a legend. They called it the Founder's Return. It was a cautionary tale whispered among the ambitious and the arrogant, a reminder that the quiet ones are often the most powerful, that you should never, ever underestimate the person who signs the checks. The story became a fable about hubris, a modern-day lesson on the difference between appearing important and actually being important. As for me, the world opened up. The weight of my secret life, which I had carried for 30 years, was finally lifted. I started going into the office again, not every day, but when I wanted to. I had an office next to Arthur's, and we would spend hours talking about the future, about steering the company back to the principles I had built it on: integrity, quality, and a commitment to our people. I felt a sense of liberation that was dizzying. I was no longer Helen, the simple grandmother, or H.A. Peterson, the reclusive founder. I was just Helen, whole and complete for the first time in a very long time. I was finally living authentically, breathing the air of a life I had built, a life I had reclaimed. Helen learned that the tallest trees can grow from the most humble soil, but only if their roots are strong. Her son had spent years trying to bury his past, ashamed of the very ground he came from. He didn't realize that everything he was reaching for, the status, the power, the respect, was built on a foundation he refused to see. He wanted the fruits without honoring the roots. And she finally understood that real justice wasn't just about cutting down the rotten branches. It was about forcing them to acknowledge the true source of the shade they once took for granted.